my name is Amanda Niedermeyer, and I am one of the school-based clinicians with Syntero. As we start into this very challenging and strange school year, two of the questions that are coming up for everybody are, one, how do staff handle the stress of the current changes and respond to the situation in a way that is going to be the most effective and help everyone manage their own stress? And two, how do we help support students as they're coming back into the learning environment this year? Something that really comes up for me when we are talking about the start of the school year is the concept of change saturation. So right now, everyone is probably feeling saturated with a lot of changes that are happening at different speeds and things that are really sort of coming at us from a lot of different directions. I really like to think of the concept of change saturation as compared to a bucket of water, and we think of the bucket as the individual or the organization, and the water is the amount of changes that are happening. So obviously, if the bucket gets too full, it overflows, and if we dump too much water into the bucket, it can also overflow. So we all have different capacities for how much change we are able to handle at any one given time, and as well as how we react to it. And then organizations usually have different capacities for how they're able to handle and respond to change. So some of the things that happen when we are saturated with so many changes at once is change fatigue. And so right now, we're all experiencing change fatigue in some way or another because there's constant changes in the news, there's constant information about what's going on with the pandemic. And so we're constantly getting information from multiple directions. And it affects our personal lives, it affects our professional lives. And then on top of that, we're also saturated with changes at the professional level. So there are constant changes to how schools are doing things and how educators are supposed to be doing their jobs. So some of the typical feelings that people might experience when we are kind of in that change saturation period are things like disengagement, so feeling numb or feeling just disengaged from your work more so than you normally would be. Some people may just kind of feel apathetic, so maybe feeling like I don't care or I don't feel as passionate about things as I normally do. Not necessarily that we don't care, but that we just don't have the capacity to respond and put our whole selves into it as much as we normally do. We might feel overwhelmed and confused. We might feel increased stress. We might feel fatigued and tired, and we might start to feel burnt out on what we're doing. And sometimes this leads to us doubting our ability to implement future changes, or even just automatically feeling a negative reaction when we hear that more changes are coming. And then eventually, sometimes this turns into we feel cynical about the world, about our position, about things that we previously might have felt more optimistic about. Now that's at the individual level. When organizations go through change fatigue, there are things that may happen like high turnover rates, decline in productivity, absenteeism, and generally a negative morale. So there are some things that we can do to help mitigate this process and to make us adapt and adjust as well as we possibly can. Some of these things may look different as far as kind of what our role is, but really it's important for us to focus on the things that are within our control. And again, this will look different depending on who we are. So there are a few things that we can do that will help mitigate some of that burnout and change fatigue. One thing is that we can try to roll out different changes with intention and roll them out with keeping certain things in mind. So we want to consider when and how we are making changes and how that might be impacting different people. For example, what people are experiencing in their personal life, as well as what other changes that person might be experiencing within the organization. So what some staff might be experiencing in relation to one aspect of their job and how that might impact an additional change being rolled out, as well as for students, maybe considering what students are experiencing and being mindful about how we are making changes for them. Another way that can be helpful for us to think about making changes is to group together tasks and categorize changes into similar groups. And so we can have maybe considering making certain changes all at once that are similar and holding off on making another category of changes. That may cut down on some of the confusion and feeling overwhelmed because things are changing that are more similar at the same time. And then also prioritizing changes. So what kinds of things can we change right now and that have to be changed right now versus things that might be able to wait until later? And so again, this goes for staff and students anytime that we are making changes for anyone. And then once we implement the changes, we want to kind of make sure that we are allowing time for everyone to process those changes, for them to have time to ask questions, and to review those changes on a consistent basis. This is especially important for students because students who are a little bit older, you might assume that they understand the process, but there still may be confusion, and so it's important to allow that space for them to ask questions and sort of adjust to it. For those of us who are not necessarily in control or in charge of making changes, it's important for us also to focus on what's within our control. And this applies to anyone, whether we are an administrator, a district administrator, a teacher, a counselor, or a student. What is within our control at this point in time? Some things may be out of our control, like the news, but we always have some level of control over ourselves in that situation. So we can control when we turn the news off or what outlet we choose to go to for our news. And so even if there's something within our organization that we may be struggling with and that we may not necessarily feel like we have a whole lot of control over, there's usually some process that you have some degree of control, whether it be asking for support, offering another possible solution, or going to someone for help. So it's important for us to remember in any situation that we are doing that for ourselves. We are relying on our supports and encouraging students to do that as well. The next thing that can be really important, especially as we are heading into the school year, is focusing on our own self-care and taking a minute to reflect on how we are coping. So in order for us to be as effective as possible and as helpful to students, we need to be regulated ourselves. So there's a quote that talks about the best thing to happen to a dysregulated student is a regulated adult. And so we need to kind of reflect on how we are feeling at this point in time and really understand that it is okay if we are not okay. A lot of us are experiencing higher levels of stress, and really just taking some time to give yourself a break and be kind to yourself and really give yourself the space to just accept that you do not know all the answers, you do not necessarily know what's going to happen, and that we are just sort of living in an uncertain time right now. We try to focus on stopping unhelpful thoughts or patterns of thinking that take us down a road that kind of increases our stress. So the more time we waste focusing on things that are outside of our control or focusing on things that we're worried about, the more time we waste. It really doesn't solve any problems. It does not really become productive for us at all. And so if we really try to focus on things are uncertain right now and that is okay, that can sometimes help to ease some of that feeling of stress and anxiety. And as we're kind of easing into the school year and encountering different stressful situations, it's really important to take mental and physical breaks throughout the day. And we want to just try to reflect and notice how we are being affected in any particular moment. So take stock of how you are being affected throughout the day. If you find that you are constantly checking the news, constantly thinking about the pandemic, searching the internet for information that's going to reassure you in some way, and then even outside of work, if we are struggling to stop thinking about work and really just finding ourselves hyper-focused on these things, it's kind of a clue that we need to do something to help us de-stress. It can be really beneficial to have a mindfulness or meditation practice, and this is not necessarily anything that you have to be an expert at. It can be as simple as just taking 5 minutes and listening to yourself take deep breaths and focusing on that. There are a lot of apps out there that can be really helpful with this. One of them is Insight Timer. One of them is Smiling Mind. There's another one called Headspace, which is really popular. And there's also a really helpful breathing app called Reach Out Breathe. We want to practice staying in the present moment and recognize that this is how I'm feeling right now and this is okay, but really trying to focus on what's happening right now and not everything else going on around us. One of the other things that we want to do is practice anti-self-care. Self-care is not necessarily sitting on the couch, binge watching Netflix, and eating chocolate. Sometimes indulging can be okay, but sometimes indulging is also avoiding, and it also can be things that are unhealthy for us. So we really want to focus on developing habits that build wellness, develop resilience, and in this case, build immunity. So it's important for us to focus on whatever we need to do to get enough sleep, get more sleep, exercise, move more, even if it's just walking around the block in between work or just taking laps around the building, or things that we can do to kind of get ourselves moving. Make sure that we're eating, make sure that we are getting appropriate nutrition, snacking throughout the day and keeping our energy levels up. All of those things are going to help us be more resilient and deal with stress in the most effective way. Now, the other thing that can be beneficial is setting work-life boundaries. And obviously, as an educator, this can be extremely difficult, and especially when we're in the midst of a global pandemic where things are constantly changing. But whatever we can do to set those boundaries and make things a little bit simpler on us. For example, reaching out to colleagues or administrators or anyone who might have some strategies for how to do the job more efficiently, how to work smarter, not harder. Clearly, this is not my area of expertise. It's how to make teaching or being in education more efficient, but I can speak to the fact that there are ways that we can all do that and kind of implement things that are going to make our jobs easier and that we can decrease our stress level. And then something that is really beneficial to anyone in a helping position is trying to focus on, why do I do this? Why did I get into this? And what inspired me initially to do this job? And really focusing on where our passions are and what we initially believed and wanted to do can really help kind of reignite some of that energy into what we're doing. If we remember who we're doing it for and why we're doing it, it can really help us filter out some of the negativity. Another thing that is really important is to make sure that we kind of know our limits on when we need to reach out for help that's beyond what some of these strategies are. At what point is it time when we feel like we need to maybe seek mental health support or just reach out for more than what we think we need? So really just keeping this in mind and knowing that everyone is kind of in this, it's new and nobody really has any of the answers, and it's okay and even healthy to just make sure that you've got someone to talk to. So as students come back in, we are really having to find ways to support them and make sure that they are feeling safe and comfortable and managing their own stress levels, which they normally have coming into the new school year, but now are increased based on things that are just rapidly changing. Students are going to experience stressors associated with school. They're going to experience stressors associated with things that are happening at home and maybe things that were more stressful over the past 5 months, as well as the absence of some social supports. They may be coming in without the extracurricular activities and sports. They may not be able to have weekend visits with friends, and they may not even necessarily be in the building at the same time as their friends. So we want to just recognize that with students and really just model healthy coping skills, model that we are able to cope with stress, and help just be there to listen and even validate what they're feeling. So I try to avoid things like saying, oh, don't worry about it, or you'll be fine, don't stress about it, it's going to be okay, because that kind of invalidates a student's experience. And it's really just helpful if we are able to listen and say, that sounds really stressful for you, what can I do to help? And just making them feel like we hear them. Just as we need to focus on what's within our control, it's important for us to help students try to focus on what's within their control. And so we want to sort of be mindful of things that may be happening at home, what they're being exposed to as far as the news or hearing information about the pandemic, and really just kind of make sure that we help them learn how to set those boundaries for themselves. So if we can help students learn to look at things through the lens of what aspect of this do I have some control over versus things I don't have control over, it will really help them to develop that resilience as well. We also realize that kids are coming in having to wear masks and social distance and go through all of these new physical protocols. So we want to encourage students to practice at home, and then maybe even having them practice, encouraging them to practice with a friend so that they feel confident in how they are doing with that. For example, they want to practice not touching their face, not pulling their mask down, keeping their mask up, and kind of dealing with that constant feeling of having it on all day. It's really important to make sure that we are identifying students who may have issues like anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder and may struggle with wearing a mask. Now, this does not mean that they can't wear one, but it may mean that we need to work with them to help them develop some skills so that they can get through the day and really do that without so much discomfort. Focusing on increasing their body awareness, so what physical sensations are they feeling? For example, a racing heart or feeling hot, and helping them learn to listen to their body and implement some deep breathing or other calming relaxation strategies that can help them calm down and effectively, adjust to the mask. And then lastly, as we should probably be doing for ourselves, we want to help kids remind each other that why are we wearing a mask? It's to protect others. It's not forever, but it is for right now. And it's so that we protect others and keep others safe. And sometimes just thinking of it from that perspective can help decrease some of the negative feelings that we have when we're wearing a mask. We know that it's not fun. We know that it's not enjoyable, and we know that it's frustrating and cumbersome on our face. But we want to just kind of help remind ourselves and remind each other of why we do that. And as always, if a student is struggling, always reach out and make sure that you know how to connect them with support, reaching out to guidance counselors, social workers, Syntero staff, or even beyond that, and making sure that they're linked with the appropriate mental health supports. And that can be very helpful so that we do not feel like we are shouldering all of the load of supporting their needs. So hopefully some of these tips were helpful, and they will help to decrease the stress and work towards helping enter this new school year. So I appreciate you having me talk today and look forward to working with all of you over the next year.